Previously, the connection of inner and outer in the organic shape, which is supposed to be present to observation, was straightaway transferred to the sphere of the inorganic. The determination which produced this transfer can now be more precisely indicated, and resulting therefrom, we still have another form and connection of this relationship. Namely, what in the case of the inorganic seems to offer the possibility of such a comparison of inner and outer, in the case of the organism is altogether absent. The inorganic inner is a simple inner which presents itself to perception as a property that merely is. Its determinateness is therefore essentially magnitude, and as a property that merely is, it appears indifferent towards the outer, or the various other sensuous properties. But the being for self of the living organism does not stand on one side in this way over against its outer. On the contrary, it has in its own self the principle of otherness. If we define being for self as simple, self-preserving relation to self, then its otherness is simple negativity. An organic unity is the unity of a self-identical relating to self and pure negativity. This unity is, qua unity, the inwardness of the organism. This is thereby in itself universal, or it is genus, but the freedom of the genus in relation to its actual existence is different from the freedom of specific gravity in relation to shape. That of the latter is a freedom that merely is. In other words, specific gravity as a particular property stands on one side. But because it is a freedom that merely is, it is also only a determinateness which essentially belongs to this shape, or whereby this shape, qua essential being, is something determinate. The freedom of the genus, however, is a universal freedom and is indifferent towards this shape or towards its actuality. The determinateness, which attaches to the being for self of the inorganic as such, falls therefore in the case of organic being under its being for self, just as in the case of the inorganic, it falls only under the being of the latter. Hence, although determinateness in the inorganic is at the same time present only as a property, yet it acquires the dignity of essential being because as a simple negative, it stands over against outer existence, which is a being for another. And this simple negative is, in its ultimate simple determinateness, a number. The organic being, however, is a singular individual which is itself pure negativity and therefore destroys within itself the fixed determinateness which attaches to indifferent being. Insofar, therefore, as it has within it the moment of indifferent being, and so too of number, this latter can be taken as merely a byproduct, but not as the essence of its vitality. Paragraph 291 is quite long, and there's a lot going on in it. All of it can be more or less represented, hopefully, by what's on the board, although I think I see where I might have to do a little bit more addition as we go along. And what's actually happening in this? Hegel has been talking quite a bit about the difference between the organic and inorganic and stressing how these are connected with each other and how the organic is not reducible to the inorganic, to the bare being, you know. And so he says the connection of inner and outer in the organic shape previously, which is supposed to be present to observation. Keep in mind that that was the whole point of this entire section. This is observing reason. So observation is trying to make sense out of the organism. Why? Because that is what, when it turned to the world and started examining it, where reason is supposed to be found, it got caught up on that, right? It found the organic shape to be somewhat of a puzzle, somewhat of an obstacle, because of teleology, because of the entire structure of organic being, and it's trying to produce laws for it. So he says it transferred the organic, this connection of the inner and outer, into the sphere of the inorganic. So now Hegel says, in a fairly long-winded way, we're going to study this in a bit more depth. Why? Because we're getting close to the end of this section. The determination which produced this transfer can now be more precisely indicated. So he says, what in the case of the inorganic seems to offer the possibility of such a comparison of inner and outer, right, is, in the case of the organism, altogether absent. So does that mean that something is lacking to the organism? No, it means that organism is actually more complex, more complicated in a metaphysical way, as well as, just to observation, than the inorganic is. The inorganic, the inner and the outer, are related together in ways that are much less problematic. So he's going to detail that first. He says the inorganic inner is a simple inner. It presents something to perception. You can actually perceive what is inner. Now, you often can't do that directly. If we're talking about, say, a chemical compound, we sort of deduce results from the experiments that we carry out, or things along those lines. But we can actually look at quite a few things by slicing them up and analyzing them in different ways. So he says it's a simple inner which presents itself to perception as a property that merely is. Its determinateness, there is determinateness in the inner, what it really is inside of itself, is merely, as Hegel says, magnitude or number. What is this going to, lead us to by contrast? You notice that I've got specific gravity here, the thing that Hegel talked about in previous paragraphs, because that was kind of a popular conception of the time. And what matters about that is that that's a number as well, and it allows things to be contrasted to each other and put into a kind of series. So he says, and as a property that merely is, it appears indifferent towards the outer, or the various other sensuous properties, what it is that the perceiver is able to take in. So he goes on and he says, the being for self of the living organism does not stand on one side in this way over against its outer. There's a different kind of connection between inner and outer in the organism than we find in inorganic beings. Or in our own time, we might think, since we love to model everything on the basis of computers, when we engage in the sort of imaginative projection onto organic beings of thinking that they're really something like algorithmic systems, just very, very complex ones. We're in effect doing what Hegel is talking about here. We're treating the organic as something inorganic. So how is the organic different? He says that the being for self of the living organism is set up differently. On the contrary, it has in its own self the principle of otherness. So there you go. That's what I forgot to put up here, otherness. Otherness is not really there in the inorganic. This is a very important distinction that Hegel is making here. It's not a distinction that he hasn't made before, right? Earlier on in this very section he did that. But it's one that he thinks we need to stress over and over and over again. This doesn't have otherness within it. It has being for otherness insofar as it is outer, just as this is being for otherness. Inorganic things interact with other inorganic things which are other to them, but it doesn't have otherness within itself as part of what's driving it. Whereas the organism does have otherness within itself. It is self-othering all the time, you might say. So it says, if we just define being for self as simple, self-preserving relation to self, now where is he getting that from? Well, that was what he's discussed much earlier in all these other paragraphs where he's talked about the nature of organic being. He says, then its otherness is simple negativity. And organic unity is the unity of a self-identical relating to self and pure negativity. A lot of metaphysical language there, right? What is he talking about? There is self-negation happening within the organic being, within its inside, within what it is in its being for self. Part of its being for self, you could say, is to not be what it is. Right? Sounds rather Sartrean, but remember that for Sartre, this only happens for consciousness, whereas this is happening for anything living, for Hegel. So he goes on and he says this unity is qua unity, the inwardness of the organism. Now he's going to make an important step here. What do we have as this innerness? It is something universal. What is universal to the organism? Well, Hegel is going to talk here about the genus, about the kind of thing that it is. He's starting on a path where he's going to talk about genus, individual, and species as something in between the two of them. So this is very important to keep in mind. Here, the primary connection is going to be between genus and individual. Genus being conceived as something that is inner, and individual as you might say, it's externalization. So he goes on and he says, we've got the genus. The freedom of the genus in relation to its actual existence is different from the freedom of specific gravity in relation to shape. In effect, what Hegel's saying is this is not particularly helpful for understanding the living organism, or indeed the genus that the living organism belongs to, what it is that makes it the kind of organism that it is. You can't have individuals without having some sort of genus, right? Because it's complicated, right? So we were tempted to use this sort of reconstruction in previous paragraphs, modeled after what's happening here in inorganic being, to make sense of the organism. And Hegel is saying to us, no, that's not the way that we want to go. Instead, we have the genus, and the genus exerts a certain kind of freedom. He says, the freedom the specific gravity has is one that merely is. In other words, specific gravity, he says, is a particular property, stands on one side, right? It's sort of indifferent to shape. That was part of the problem. There seemed to be some arbitrariness here that doesn't get us the relationship of expression. He says, because it is a freedom that merely is, it is also only a determinateness which essentially belongs to this shape, or whereby this shape as essential being is something determinate. So if we're getting away from that, and we're talking about the freedom of the genus, he says, the freedom of the genus is a universal freedom and is indifferent towards this shape or towards its actuality. There is a certain, I don't want to say indeterminateness, because we're talking about determination right now. What is it for something to be a crayfish? What is it for something to be a horse? What is it for something to be a microbe that, attaches itself to a particular type of host tissue? What is it for something to be an elephant, right? All of these are questions that we're asking about the genus. And the genus itself, we were tempted to reduce it just to a bunch of qualities or classifications, but really each one of them, insofar as it is a genus of a living type of being, possesses an internal unity, a coherence, a universality, a relationship to self, as well as an externalization in individuals. That's what Hegel is calling here the freedom of the genus. So he says, the determinateness which attaches to the being for self of the inorganic as such falls, therefore, in the case of organic being, under its being for self. Just as in the case of the inorganic, it falls only under the being of the latter. Hence, although determinateness in the inorganic is at the same time present only as a property, it acquires the dignity of essential being, because as a simple negative, it stands over against outer existence, which is being for another. What's going on here is much, much more complicated, not only in terms of structure, but in terms of the very metaphysics involved. So he goes on and he says, the organic being is a singular individual, which is itself pure negativity. How is it pure negativity? That's what we're going to have to examine. So he says, it destroys within itself the fixed determinateness which attaches to indifferent being, the external of, say, a crystal, or a book, or a piece of chalk, or a piece of clothing. He says, insofar as it has within itself the moment of indifferent being and of number, this latter can be taken merely as a byproduct, but not as the essence of its vitality. So where should we look then for the essence of the vitality, the liveliness, the ability to respond to external circumstances, to modify itself, to continue on? Well, that's a question that we're going to have to answer as we move through the next paragraphs. But now, through pure negativity, the principle of the process does not fall outside of the organism, which therefore does not have it in its essence as a determinateness, the single individual being itself intrinsically universal. Yet in the organism, the moments of this pure individual are not developed and actual as moments which are themselves abstract or universal. On the contrary, their expression appears outside of that universality, which falls back into the inwardness of the organism, and between the actual existence or shape, that is the self-developing individual, and the organic universal or the genus, there comes the determinate universal, the species. The concrete existence attained by the negativity of the universal or the genus is only the developed movement of a process which runs its course in the parts of the inert existence of the shape. If the genus, as a quiescent unitary being, had within it the differentiated parts, and if, too, its simple negativity as such were at the same time a movement which ran through parts which were equally simple and immediately universal in themselves, parts which here were actual as such moments, then the organic genus would be consciousness. But as it is, the simple determinateness, qua determinateness of the species, is present in the genus in a non-spiritual manner. Actuality starts from the genus, or what enters into actual existence is not the genus as such, that is, in general, not the thought of it. The genus as an actual organism is merely represented by a surrogate, by number. This latter, number, seems to mark the transition from the genus into the individual structured shape, and to provide observation with the two necessary aspects of the latter. One is a simple determinateness, and the other as a shape whose manifold nature is fully developed. This number, however, really indicates the indifference and freedom of the universal and the individual in relation to one another. The genus puts the individual at the mercy of the non-essential quantitative difference, but the individual itself, qua living individual, equally shows itself to be free. True universality, as we have defined it, is here only in inner essence. As determinateness of the species, it is a formal universality, and over against this, the true universality takes its stand on the side of the single individual, which is thereby a living individual, and in virtue of its inner being takes no account of its determinateness as species. But this individual is not at the same time a universal individual, that is, one in which the universality would have an outer actual existence as well. The universal individual falls outside of the living organism. This universal individual, however, as immediately the individual of natural structured shapes, is not consciousness itself. Its existence as a single organic living individual must not fall outside of it if it is to be consciousness. Paragraph 292 is one of those problematic paragraphs in which Hegel is going to narrate for us what consciousness is supposed to be observing as it works through its conceptions about the nature of organic being and all these things that we've been studying up until this point, but doesn't attain a real resolution. Instead, what ends up happening is all of the possible relations or resolutions end up getting problematized further. He's bringing us ultimately to a crux. And notice what I've done here. No longer is inner and outer identifiable, strictly with something like the genus or the individual. We have the inner, ultimately being expressed in the outer, at least hopefully. But now intersecting it, we have this other axis, you might say, that Hegel's talking about in terms of the genus, which is a certain kind of universal, the Gattung, right? And the individual, which is also in a certain respect universal, but all that universal is going to get sort of lost, and it takes on determinate shape or shapes. And then in between, we have what he's calling, he's introducing another point to this, the determinate universal, or the species, the art. So how is this going to play itself out? He says the principle of the process doesn't fall outside of the organism through this pure negativity. So it doesn't have in its essence as a determinateness the single individual being itself intrinsically universal, right? But in the organism, the moments of this pure individual are not developed and actual as moments which are themselves abstract or universal. In a certain respect, does it make sense to talk about a single determinate individual of a genus, of a species, a living thing, as being abstract, as being universal in that sense? What we see here is Hegel is playing with the sense of universal, which doesn't always mean the same thing in every circumstance. So he goes on and he says, on the contrary, this their expression appears outside of that universality. The universality, he says, falls back into the interior, the inner, right? The inwardness of the organism. And between the actual existence or shape, that is the self-developing individual, and the organic universal or the genus, there comes the determinate universal, the species. The concrete existence attained by the negativity of the universal or the genus, right? Here's the genus, is only the developed movement of a process which runs its course in the parts of the inert existence of the shape. So he says, now he talks about the genus as being a quiescent, unitary being. Restful, quiescent, ruhiga, right? The genus doesn't actually do anything like, let's just imagine bunny rabbits for a moment, right? The genus of bunny rabbit doesn't go out there and nibble on grass and look around trepidatiously at hawks or dogs and burrow into the dirt and copulate and make all sorts of new bunny rabbits. Although in a certain sense it does, right? Because all rabbits are presumably doing that sort of thing, although not all of them are. Perhaps some of them, miss the mark in that respect. But it's not engaging in that sort of activity or action which is characteristic of the type of thing that we're talking about, right? So he goes on and he says, the genus, if the genus had within it the differentiated parts, and if too its simple negativity were at the same time a movement which ran through parts which were equally simple and immediately universal in themselves, parts which here were actual moments, then the organic genus would be consciousness. Now that's kind of an interesting departure, isn't it? The genus itself doesn't have any consciousness as genus. Genus is what we are conscious of, and we can say that insofar as any particular type of being apprehends itself as being that type of being, it has consciousness of itself as being that type of being. What do I mean by this? When we think, for example, about elephants recognizing each other as elephants and communicating with each other, or even the fact that elephants, as we now know, are intelligent enough to have some sort of orientation towards their own dead. That means something. There's a kind of consciousness going on there. But that's not happening on the part of the genus itself, right? Because the genus is abstract. The genus is, you might say, an idea. It's not something that has that externalized reality that allows it to be in relation to the world in determinate shapes that blend into each other from moment to moment to moment. So he goes on and he says, as it is, the simple determinateness, qua-determinateness of the species is present in the genus in a non-spiritual manner, in a non-geistige. It's not something that has consciousness. It's something we can observe, certainly, right? So he says, actuality starts from the genus, or what enters into actual existence is not the genus as such. That is, in general, not the thought of it. The genus as an actual organism is merely represented by surrogate. And now we see once again Hegel going back to this, notion that we could like give some sort of number for genus. But we've seen that this is a failed approach, right? You're not going to get any real mileage out of assigning some sort of number like specific gravity or whatever you like. We may as well just come up with an ordering system that randomly assigns numbers to particular kinds of being, and that would be just as handy, wouldn't it, in the end? So he says this latter seems to mark the transition from the genus into the individual structured shape. Seems to, but it actually doesn't. And the problem is, it doesn't provide observation with what it is that it's looking for. He says the number really indicates the indifference and the freedom of the universal and the individual in relation to each other. The genus puts the individual at the mercy of the non-essential quantitative difference. The individual, in order to fit into that. Now the individual, as the individual really exists, could care less about whatever number reason wants to assign to it. The bunny rabbit hopping around doesn't really care if we assign it a 5 or an 8 or a 10 or whatever, right? And it's not like reality itself is doing so. It's us human beings and observing reason who are trying to do that. But once we enter into that scheme and we start engaging in this thought process involved with numbers, there's a disconnect here, right? And this disconnect loses any hold on the species. So he says the genus puts the individual at the mercy of the non-essential quantitative difference. The individual itself equally shows itself to be free. That is, unconstrained. That is, able to sort of thumb its little bunny nose at what the universal says that it ought to do. And we see this occurring, right? Even if we don't do it in terms of quantity, and we do it in terms of quality, the conception, the genus that we have, that we're using, the thought, right, of the thing, often, the constraints that seem to be imposed on it, the actual living organisms, the individual beings, do quite otherwise. We don't even have to appeal to necessarily something like evolution to talk about that. That has to do with entire species and random differences and reproduction. We can just talk in terms of we have our conception of what dog is, and then there's dogs that don't actually conform to it. They surprise us. They go beyond the idea that we have coming to us from the genus. So he says, true universality is here only as an inner essence, the determinateness of the species. It is a formal universality. Over against this, the true universality takes its stand on the side of the single individual, which is thereby a living individual, and in virtue of its inner being, takes no account of its determinateness as a species. But, he says, this individual is not at the same time a universal individual. We could say that any individual thing wants to be what it is, and it wants to be, to some degree, unconstrained by the universal that it should fall into. It wants to be its own universal. It wants to be, you might say, sui generis, as we say. Not of any genus, not of any species. But that's not really possible, is it? The determinate being is a being of a particular type. And so it cannot be a universal individual, he says, one in which the universality would have an outer actual existence as well. This universal individual falls outside of the living organism. What does that mean? Well, this is not the same thing as this. This, you might say, expresses that, and now we get something like inner and outer, right? But that's not the same thing as being it. So he goes on and he says, this universal individual, however, as immediately the individual of natural structured shapes, is not consciousness itself. Its existence as a single organic living individual must not fall outside of it if it is to be consciousness. What does that tell us? Here we're dealing with something that is less a solution or a resolution and more the beginnings of a problem. Where does consciousness fit in with this? That's something that we want to know, in part because observing reason is supposed to be observing itself in the world. What it's finding in the world is what it is brought to the world. So how is this going to work? We have to look at the next paragraph to see that. Consequently, we have a syllogism in which one extreme is the universal life as a universal or as genus, the other extreme, however, being the same universal as a single individual or as a universal individual. But the middle term is composed of both. The first seems to fit itself into it as a determinate universality or as species, the other, however, as individuality proper or as a single individual. And since this syllogism pertains wholly to the aspect of the structured shape, it equally embraces within its scope what is distinguished as inorganic nature. In paragraph 293, we see Hegel once again using his language and conceptual framework of syllogism and finding the middle term. Remember, the middle term or the mediating term is what connects the two extremes, what allows them to be brought into connection with each other. And this is a short paragraph. There's not a lot going on here other than sort of just setting this out. He tells us that we have two extremes. On the one side, we have universal life, which can be understood as the universal or the genus, right? A universal of a certain sort. On the other side, however, we have the universal as well, right? So the universal has been kind of split. The universal as individual or the single individual, the thing that actually lives, right? We have the type and we have the instance, the reality. We have the idea and we have the thing. But these are both self-related, and they both have otherness within them and are related to each other in otherness. So how do we bring these together? Hegel says that we have a middle term, and instead of just saying, okay, and the middle term is X, notice what he says. He tells us that the middle term itself is kind of split, or it has two sides binding it together, right? So we might say that this is all the middle term, but the middle term, insofar as it presents its face to the other side, it looks different. So on the side closest to universal life, we have the species. On this side, we have individuality as something different than being a single individual. You might say, well, what is that? Well, think about it. The general case of being an individual. That's different than actually being this particular individual. So he says that since the syllogism pertains wholly to the aspect of the structured shape, it equally embraces within its scope what is distinguished as inorganic nature. This applies not only to organic nature, but also encompasses inorganic nature, which really doesn't, this is more complicated in many respects in terms of universality than inorganic nature provides us with. But that's because organic nature, we often think of, and this is a little bit of a digression, but it's worth reflecting on here. We often think of life as something that's sort of extra. It's added on to inorganic nature. It emerges out of it, perhaps, or it's an extra property. Hegel doesn't see things that way. And this, in a certain respect, represents a more ancient view, I would say, that says that the higher is really the origin of the lower, not the other way around. That's because for Hegel, the higher has always been there, working itself through, just not being recognized. So, you could have it looking like it's emergent, even though it isn't really so, or only is so within a certain perspective. But here's the syllogism as Hegel lays it out in a schematic form. This is the mediating term, and now in the paragraphs to come, we're going to explore that a little bit further and bring this section to a close.